Chapter 15. Aftermath. The prince woke to sunshine, warm and creamy like freshly churned butter, playing across his face. His body was swaying slightly, which seemed strange. He was relatively certain that one did not naturally sway when one was lying down, but then again he supposed one could never be entirely certain. He chuckled to himself. He sounded like Joffred. Who was that again? Who was... Oh, well, there it was, of course. Joffred was his pet eagle. Pet eagle? He twitched slightly as he heard a voice talking to him in the back of his head. He told it to leave him alone. He could have a pet eagle if he wanted to. But the voice just laughed. Wake up, princeling. He opened his eyes and reality resolved into being. A face was peering down at him, black hair with green eyes. A few freckles across the nose. A strong mouth, curved in a grin. Leah! He exclaimed. He sat up and realized that he was in a litter, slung between two horses he hadn't seen before, and Leah was walking behind him and watching him over the edge of the wooden frame. Tomaz was leading the horses down a narrow but surprisingly well-laid woodland trail. A third horse was tied behind the litter and was loaded down with most of the packs and supplies. Thanks for joining us, Leah said. And I sincerely hope you don't think your brother Joffred is an actual eagle, rumbled Tomaz from up ahead. The prince rubbed his head, which felt fuzzy. I said that out loud? He asked. You're a pretty big sleep-talker, princeling, Leah said, ruffling his hair and giving his head a playful push. We certainly learned a lot more about your feelings for a young lady by the name of Monsoon? I forget, what was it, Eshendai? Leah let out a laugh like a peal of a bell, as bright and golden as the day. The prince felt his cheeks burn, and he lay back down on the litter. I'm going back to bed, he said, mortified. I think not, said Tomaz. I want to know more about this lady's magnificent bosom. I did not say that, the prince protested, sitting bolt upright and pointing at Tomaz severely with an outstretched finger. The big man just smiled and shrugged. The prince caught Leah stifling a laugh out of the corner of his eye. Don't encourage him, the prince said. He looked around and realized he had no idea where they were and said as much. A few days past Lake Chartain, responded Tomaz. Past Lake Chartain? Indeed, Tomaz rumbled. We've hauled your skinny butt nearly 100 miles, but it's fine. We know princes need their beauty sleep. And what? The prince paused and cleared his throat before continuing. What happened after... He broke off as the memories came to him and left the sentence unfinished. You mean after you saved this girl's worthless hide? Tomaz asked. Leah stooped, picked up a pebble, and threw it at him. It glanced harmlessly off his massive shoulder. Just say that again, Ashandel, she taunted. I can take you. Tomaz pretended to cower in fear. Leah laughed. Why are you in such a good mood? The prince asked. What do you mean, why are we in such a good mood? Leah said. You might defy death and certain torture every day back in the great big capital city of Lucien, but out here, being spared all that is cause for celebration. But aren't we still being followed? He asked. Not as far as we know, Tomaz said. We did some serious scouting and found that those defenders were the only ones who knew where we were, and you, the big man looked back over his shoulder at the prince, you certainly dealt with them. Yes, the prince said, his mood darkening as vague shapes and images came back to him, his own memories of the memories that he had absorbed from the men he had killed. Suddenly he felt immensely tired and ravenously hungry. Leah seemed to have anticipated this. She passed him a small hunk of bread and cheese and a water skin. Without even thanking her, he tore into the food and drank heavily from the skin. He wondered how long it had been since he had eaten and how many days he had lain unconscious after he had killed the defenders. The food turned to ash in his mouth, and his appetite left him. He saw Tomaz and Leah exchange a significant glance. You never told us the exact details of what you could do, Tomaz said. Would have been nice to know. Come in handy in a fight. Yes, well, that's why I don't kill unless I have to, the prince said. Both of the exiles were looking at him intently now, and, reluctantly, feeling every word pulled from him like a splinter from under his fingernails, he attempted to explain. The Raven Talisman connects me to the life of everything around me. But human life is somehow more than anything else. Brighter, more intense. When a person dies, well, When I kill someone, I absorb their life. Joffred always said he was more inclined to think it was their soul, since I don't just absorb their physical qualities, but also what makes them them. Memories, fears, anger, happiness. It used to be when I was younger that I would absorb other things too. One time I even got a rash, damned inconvenient, but that hasn't happened in a long time. He was studying the grassy ground of the forest to his right, not wanting to talk at the two exiles. For some reason he couldn't put a finger on, he felt ashamed talking about this with them. As if he were talking about something dark or unclean, something that shouldn't be talked about in polite conversation. And after a certain time, Leah said gently, "The memories fade?" "Yes," the prince said, not knowing why he continued to speak, but feeling compelled to do so. "Impressions of them remain. Memories of those memories. The first time was bad. It was the first state execution I took part in. The man had taken a woman by force." The prince felt more than saw the girl tense, and he couldn't bring himself to look up at Tomas to see how the big man was reacting. "I relived every action for an hour. I lived in his skin. I was too young to know anything about right or wrong, really, but I knew that something about it was monstrous, and I couldn't let it go. I couldn't push it away. The experience was unpleasant." He almost said more, but then he closed his mouth. He couldn't continue. They had stopped moving sometime along the way, and for a long moment the three of them just stood in the silence, the prince looking intently at the hunting trail beneath his litter, and the two exiles looking intently at him. Tomas was the first to move. He crossed the distance to the prince and placed two enormous hands on his shoulders, nearly engulfing his head. "I had no idea," he said simply. "For what it counts, to survive that as the man you are, you're stronger than I will ever be." The prince felt the corners of his eyes prickle, and a lump formed in his throat. He sat there for a moment, holding himself in check, and then he looked up, cleared his throat gruffly, and nodded. The big man, his stony black eyes watching closely, nodded as well, and dropped his hands. "There's a stream not too far from here. I'll go fill up the waterskins. I know it's a bit early, but I say we make camp here for the night, unless anyone has any objections." "None from me," Leah said. "All right," the prince said, anxious to change the subject. Tomas nodded, grabbed the waterskins, and headed off into the trees. The prince pulled himself to the edge of the litter and slowly slid himself to the ground. He let out a small groan as 100 aches and pains suddenly came crashing down on him. "Oh, shadows and light, that hurts." "Are you all right?" Leah asked, looking genuinely concerned. The prince slowly straightened up, his back letting out several loud cracks, and stretched. He took a deep breath, and in spite of all that had happened in the last few weeks, he realized he actually did feel rather good. "Yes," he said, surprise coloring his voice. "Yes, I think I do feel all right." "In that case, help with the food," she said, motioning to the packs on the horse. She was untying the strings holding the litter. "How did we get back to Tomas?" he asked, opening a pack at random and looking into it. "Other pack," Leah said. "And you and I got back to Tomas on these horses. Both Trudger and Malial were put down by the defenders. Tomas was pretty torn up about Malial. They've been together for years now. But, in the end, there was plenty of good Tiber stock running around after you fainted. So I picked 3, tied you to 1, and rode them back." "Fainted?" the prince asked, pulling open the other pack. "Yes, fainted." "I didn't faint." Leah looked at him with an amused expression over the backs of the horses. "Oh, you didn't?" "No," the prince said. "I fell unconscious due to the strain of saving you. See, it sounds better that way, much more like something a prince would do." Leah rolled her eyes, and he smiled. "You fainted, princeling. Fine, but while rescuing you, so still princely." She laughed and shook her head. She undid the final strap holding the litter in place, and it fell to the ground in a clatter of wood. "Whatever you say. You've been riding in this for almost a week now, sleeping like a little baby. Aside from the occasional muttering about Lady Monsoon, of course." She smirked at him and bent to pull the wood they had used for the litter frame out from the tangle of blankets they'd stretched across it. "You know what's funny?" the prince asked. "I never should have said that to you. You use that expression too much now." "Yes, but you know what's funny?" The girl sighed. The prince managed to locate the last of the dried venison and 3 large rolls of bread and a wheel of cheese that must have been scavenged off the defenders. "All right," she said, "what's funny?" The prince was sure she was hiding a smile, and so he continued on boldly. "Her name was Leah too, but you two couldn't be more different." The girl froze, and then slowly turned back to him, her face blank. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Well," he said, "she's one of the daughters of the Most High, so she's trained in all the courtly manners of Lucien. I don't think she's ever seen a dagger in her entire life, much less held one, and she was always wearing the most fashionable dress of the season. I don't think I could see you in a dress, and certainly not the one she wore. I don't know how she got into those things. I mean, someone must have poured her into them, which is part of how you're different, because you are much more—" He cut off as he caught a glimpse of her face, which looked as though she were ready to torture a small woodland creature. Are you all right?" he asked, suddenly concerned. "Fine," she said. "I'll just leave you to your reminiscing about the Lady Monsoon and the dresses she needed to be poured into. Not really something I'm interested in." She turned on her heel and stalked off across the clearing, brushing past Tomas, who had just returned from the stream. He looked from the girl back to the prince and shook his head. "You couldn't keep a memory or two of how to talk to a woman?" he asked. The prince had no response to this, and so he refrained from speaking and helped Tomas with the fire, trying to figure out where he had gone wrong. He'd only been trying to compliment the girl. Sure, she wouldn't fill out a dress like Lady Monsoon, but who cared about that out here? What she could do with her daggers was worth 10 times that. Leah came back sometime later, her arms full of large white mushrooms. "Surprise!" she called to them, and the prince was glad to see that whatever anger she had been holding against him had passed. "I found these down by the stream. We can cook them tonight and store them for travel." Tomas said, licking his lips. "Daishanes, my favorite." They made and ate dinner quickly that night, talking happily amongst themselves. Afterward, the prince and Tomas sparred while Leah watched. When they were done, the prince was covered in sweat and sore beyond belief. A sudden idea occurred to him. "Did you say there was a stream nearby?" Tomas nodded. "I think I'd like to go," the prince said. "It's been a long time since— well, I would like to clean myself. That is to say, Yeah, you wish to bathe, we understand," Leah said. "It's that way, though why you want to go when it's so cold is beyond me." "I like the cold," the prince said, and then he excused himself, gathering up the grooming materials Leah had loaned him and making his way through the trees in the direction the girl had pointed. She'd been right. The water was close to freezing. But when the prince stripped off and washed his bruised and battered body, he felt that the cold was worth the cleansing. He scraped himself with Leah's comb and some of Tomas's soap, thinking about what he would have said about all of this back in the fortress if he could see himself now. Once he'd finished, he made his way back to the fire, wrapped in every piece of clothing he possessed. As he approached the camp, he heard the exiles conversing softly. His comb slipped from his hand, and he pulled up short and bent down to pick it up. It took him a while to find it in the darkness, and as he searched, he overheard Tomas speaking. "And then through the pass and on to Vale." The prince froze. They must be consulting the girl's map, something they never did when he was nearby. He straightened up, comb in hand, and watched them through the trees. The girl and the big man exchanged glances and then broke into smiles. "Home," Leah said. "Home," Tomas agreed. They held the smile for a long moment, sharing a joy and elation that made the prince giddy just watching it. He began to come forward but stopped when Leah spoke again. "What about the prince?" she asked. Tomas, who had begun to busy himself with his bedroll, turned slowly back around to look at her. "What about him?" he asked. The girl stood up, rolling up the map and tucking it under her arm. "He's a product of the Empire," she said. She was facing away from the prince, and he couldn't see her face, but her voice sounded resigned and sad. "He's a product of a society whose teachings are that rebellion is the worst sin anyone can commit. You saw the power he has. Do we risk taking him to Vale? Taking him to our home? Knowing now what he's capable of? Knowing that he has been taught since infancy to hate us and everything we stand for?" Tomas studied her face for a long moment. "He's changed," he said finally. "You can see it in his eyes. He sees us as his family now, not as members of the exiled kindred." "I know that, Tomas," she said, and the prince could hear, to his surprise, true affection in her voice. "But how will he see the rest of us?" "We shouldn't be having this conversation, Esh and I. You and I both know that he has changed. He saved your life, and from what you described, doing so almost cost him his. He has great power, but he sees it as a curse, and if nothing else, that gives me hope." "Hope for what, Tomas? Hope that he won't butcher us all while we sleep when he has a fond daydream about home? What if we take him to Vale and we find out that we were wrong about him?" "Enough," Tomas said. The prince was surprised to hear disgust in his voice. "You were chosen, Eshendai, to teach me, and I was chosen, Ashandel, to teach you. This is something you have never understood. People change. The kindred took me in, one of the elite members of the Guardians, and I have become as loyal and proud a citizen of Vale as any man or woman born there. I remember them also taking in a scared young girl who didn't know where to turn when she—" "Stop," she said harshly. "I know. But he's the Prince of Ravens, Tomas. The Empress isn't some distant master or religious icon to him. She's his mother. And if you want to talk about who knows how difficult it is to abandon one's family, then I think we can both agree that I know more about it than you." "We owe him a chance," Tomas said emphatically. "If nothing else, we owe him a chance." The girl paused. Finally, she looked down and nodded. All right, we take him to Vale," she said. "But if it were up to me, he'd come as our prisoner, or not at all. He's the Prince of Ravens, and nothing will change that, no matter how many times we save him or he saves us. We're the exception to his rule that all exiles are bad. He just happened to find 2 good ones. That's what he thinks. You can see it in his eyes. That's the change you're talking about, and it's a good change. But if you, speaking to me as Ashandel, tell me that this is something I need to accept, then I will heed your word." Tomas looked at her for a long time, and what the prince saw in the big man's face broke his heart. The giant didn't speak, but instead turned away from the girl, and they both began to get ready for bed. For a long time, the prince stood in the shadows, not knowing what to think. He remembered the looks of happiness they had exchanged, the happiness of going home that he had wanted to share with them. But now he realized how foolish that desire had been. They wouldn't want him to share in it. The exiled kindred would treat him just as Leah had, with suspicion and fear. And if he couldn't go with them, and he couldn't go back, then where could he go? He turned around and walked away from the clearing once more. It was a strange thing, not having a home. He had been cast out of the place he had grown up, cast out of the society he'd been born into, and now, was he going to join a band of rebels? When had he made that decision? He was an outcast, it was true, but he wasn't an exile. Not really. Not like they were. He wasn't, and just as Leah had said, some last shred of pride in the Empire clung to him and made him reject those that had rejected it. True, there was injustice. There were things to be improved. But that was the responsibility of the princes of the realm, endowed with the power of the talismans in order to make a difference for good in the Empire of Lucia. It was his responsibility, and he couldn't run from that. After everything, the girl was right. How had she known? He couldn't turn his back on his duty. He knew that, now more than ever. He was not, nor could he ever be, anything less than the Prince of Ravens, and it was his duty to remain with the Empire, even when it had turned its back on him. True, things were bad, he knew that now. But not so bad that the Empire itself was beyond redemption. Perhaps if the situation were presented to sympathetic parties the right way, perhaps to the right members of the Most High, maybe even Joffred, then things could be improved. That was the way the Empire was supposed to work. Wasn't it? He shook his head, dislodging the thoughts. Open rebellion was not the answer. He turned and looked back through the trees toward where the exiles were, reminiscing about their home, a home that had betrayed the Empire. They were traitors, and they were criminals. But these two are good people, a voice said in the back of his mind, echoing Leah's words. Good people who care about you, who have saved your life. People you cared about enough to use the talisman to help, to keep them from your own brother's men and the justice of the Empire. Shadows and light, he muttered under his breath. They're committed to overthrowing the Empire, even the good that the Empire has in it. He stood there for a long time as night truly fell, the twilight fading to complete black. Eventually, he made his way back to the fire. When he came into the clearing, he saw that Leah was curled up in a ball under a blanket by the fire, one hand on a dagger, ready for a fight even in sleep. Tomas looked up from where he sat. "I was about to come looking for you, princeling," the big man rumbled with a smile that made the prince's stomach clench. The prince forced his mouth into a grimace that he hoped passed for a smile, and made an excuse about wanting to walk to stretch his cramped legs. He picked up the spare blanket and curled up under it in the crook of a nearby tree. As he did so, he saw that the area beneath it had been purposefully cleared of rocks and roots by a deft hand. He looked up and saw Tomas wink at him. "We know you like to sleep under trees. It was her idea." He motioned his head toward the sleeping girl. "Thank you," the prince said, "but I'm not very tired at the moment. I can take the first watch if you'd like. After all, I've slept quite a lot recently. I'll wake you when the fire dies down." Tomas's eyes widened in surprise, but he smiled appreciatively. "Sounds good to me," he said, and pulled his own blanket over himself and lay back, his head pillowed on his crossed arms. The prince sat staring into the fire for a long time, wondering what he was going to do when morning came.